Chapter 1. The drip torch felt heavy in my hands, probably because we'd been at this for 3 straight days. My shoulders ached from the constant movement, igniting, walking, checking the burn line. Repeat. The prescribed burn was going exactly as planned, which in Park Service terms meant controlled chaos that somehow worked out in the end. I changed my grip on the torch and checked the flame. Still good. Around me, the crew moved through their practiced routine of clearing brush in systematic patches. The whole operation was designed to prevent bigger wildfires later, but right now it just felt like we were playing with matches in a very expensive, very protected sandbox. David appeared through a wall of smoke about 50 yards to my left, his radio crackling with position updates. He'd been working the eastern perimeter all morning while I handled the center sections. We'd developed a good rhythm over the past few days. Him calling out obstacles, me changing the burn pattern accordingly. "Mike," he called out, but something in his voice made me look up from the torch controls. He wasn't moving forward anymore, just standing there, staring through the haze. I killed the flame and walked over to him. "What's up?" He pointed ahead through the smoke. "You see that?" I followed his line of sight, squinting through the gray curtain that hung between the trees. At first, nothing looked different from any other section of forest we'd been working. Then the smoke moved, and I saw it. A log cabin sat in a clearing about 100 yards ahead of us. "That's not supposed to be there," David said, which was exactly what I was thinking, but hadn't managed to say yet. I pulled out my field map and checked our coordinates. We were deep in Section 7, an area I'd looked at thoroughly during our planning phase. No structures marked anywhere in this grid. No maintenance buildings, no historical sites, nothing. Park records went back decades, and I'd studied every notation. "Maybe it's an old ranger station," David suggested, but he didn't sound convinced. I folded the map and started walking toward the building. David followed, both of us moving carefully through the scattered burn areas. The closer we got, the more wrong everything felt. The cabin wasn't falling apart like it should have been after years of being left alone. The logs looked weathered but solid, with no obvious rot or damage to the structure. The roof showed intact shingles, and the windows, I could see the windows clearly now, were clean. Not just unbroken, but actually clean, like someone had wiped them down recently. "This doesn't make sense," I said, more to myself than to David. The building was old. That much was obvious from the construction style. Rough-cut logs, traditional chinking, the kind of work that hadn't been done in the park for 50 years or more. But everything about it suggested recent occupation. No broken windows, no sagging foundation, no overgrown plants creeping up the sides. I stopped about 20 feet from the front door and really looked at the place. It was small, maybe 2 rooms, with a stone chimney that showed no cracks. A neat stack of firewood sat beside the entrance, the pieces cut to identical lengths and arranged with military precision. David came up beside me. "You think someone's been living out here?" Before I could answer, I heard my name. "Michael." The voice came from inside the cabin, deep and clear through the closed door and windows. It wasn't shouted or called out, just spoken at normal volume, but somehow I heard every syllable perfectly. Cold shot through my chest and down into my stomach. The voice wasn't right. Too deep, too resonant, like it was coming from somewhere much larger than a human throat. It carried a heaviness that pressed against my ears in a way that made me want to cover them. "Michael." There it was again. The same impossible depth, the same unnatural clarity. No human voice sounded like that. No human voice could sound like that. I took a step backward, then another. My hand started shaking, and I realized I was still holding the drip torch. "Hey, what's wrong?" David was looking at me instead of the cabin. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I tried to speak, but nothing came out. The voice had called my name, not Ranger or Hey You or any generic call that might apply to anyone. My actual name, spoken with complete certainty. "We need to leave," I managed to say. The words came out rough and thin. "Right now." "What? Why?" David glanced between me and the cabin. "Don't we need to report this? I mean, someone's obviously been using it without authorization." "No." I was already backing away, putting more distance between myself and the building. "We're leaving. Now." David stared at me like I'd lost my mind, which maybe I had. I couldn't explain what I'd heard because it didn't make sense. Voices don't sound like that. People don't just know your name when they've never met you. "Mike, seriously, what's going on?" I looked back at the cabin one more time. The windows were dark now, showing nothing but black interior. No movement, no sign of anyone inside. But I knew someone was in there. Someone who knew my name and spoke with a voice that belonged in nightmares, not in a remote section of Yellowstone. "Pack it up," I told David. "We're done here." He opened his mouth to argue, then seemed to notice something in my expression that made him think twice. "Okay, but you're going to have to explain this to Wilson." I nodded, even though I had no idea what I was going to tell our supervisor. That I'd heard an impossible voice call my name from an unauthorized building that shouldn't exist. That every instinct I had was telling me to get away from this place and never come back. We hiked back to where the rest of the crew was working. I radioed the team leads and called an early end to the day's operations. Nobody questioned the order directly, but I caught the looks they gave each other as we started packing up the equipment. The walk back to the ranger station took 40 minutes, and I spent every step of it trying to make sense of what had happened. By the time we reached the parking area, I'd almost convinced myself that the smoke had played tricks with sound, that someone had been camping illegally, and I'd misheard them calling out. Almost. But I could still hear that voice in my head, the unnatural depth of it, the way it had spoken my name like it was tasting the syllables. That wasn't smoke playing tricks. That was something else entirely. David loaded his gear into the truck and gave me another concerned look. "You sure you're okay?" "Yeah," I lied. "Just tired." He didn't believe me, but he didn't push it either. The rest of the crew finished packing in silence, probably sensing that something had gone wrong, but not knowing what to ask. As we drove away from the burn site, I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see that cabin somehow following us through the trees. The rational part of my brain knew that was impossible, but rational didn't seem to be working very well right now. The voice had known my name. That was the part I couldn't get past, couldn't explain away. In all my years working the park, I'd never encountered anything that left me feeling this troubled. I stared out the window at the passing forest and tried to prepare myself for the conversation I was going to have with Wilson. Because David was right. I was going to have to explain why I'd called off a perfectly good burn operation and dragged the whole crew back to base. I just had no idea what I was going to say. I parked the truck and sat there for a moment, watching James through the station window. He was bent over paperwork at his desk, probably reviewing burn permits or maintenance schedules. Normal supervisor stuff, the kind of predictable routine that made sense, unlike whatever I was about to tell him. David grabbed his gear from the truck bed and gave me another one of those looks he'd been shooting my way since we left the burn site. "You coming in?" "Yeah." I forced myself to get out and follow him toward the building. The ranger station smelled like coffee and old wood, the same mix it always carried. James looked up when we walked in, his reading glasses sitting on the end of his nose. The afternoon shift was wrapping up, which meant fewer people around to overhear whatever conversation was about to happen. "How'd the burn go today?" James asked, already reaching for the operation log. David looked at me, then back at James. "We had to wrap up early. Mike found something unusual." I appreciated that he'd given me the opening instead of launching into his own version of events. James set down his pen and looked at me expectantly. "We discovered a structure," I said. "Section 7, grid reference Echo 4, a log cabin." The words came out more clinical than I'd intended, like I was reporting a routine boundary marker or trail obstacle. James raised an eyebrow and pulled out the sector maps. "Structure." He spread the papers across his desk and traced our route with his finger. "There's nothing authorized in that area. Nothing on record anywhere in Section 7. "I know." I moved closer to the desk and pointed to the coordinates I'd marked on my field map. "Right here. Small cabin, maybe 2 rooms. Hand-hewn logs, stone chimney, in good condition." James studied the location, then pulled out a thick folder of historical records. He flipped through pages of park documentation, maintenance logs, and construction permits dating back decades. His expression grew more serious as he worked. "Mike, there hasn't been any authorized construction in that sector for over 50 years. The last structure was a fire lookout tower, and that was removed in 1972. He looked up from the paperwork. "You're absolutely certain about the location?" "Positive." David nodded. "I saw it too. Definitely a cabin. Definitely shouldn't be there." James closed the folder and leaned back in his chair. The lines between his eyebrows had gotten deeper. "Could be squatters. Illegal construction. Wouldn't be the first time someone tried to build unauthorized shelters in remote areas." The rational explanation should have been reassuring, but it made my stomach clench instead, because I knew what James was thinking, what any supervisor would think. Pack up a team, investigate the site, document everything, and figure out who was responsible, which meant going back. "We need to return immediately," James said, already reaching for his radio. "Full team, cameras, documentation equipment. If someone's been building without permits, we need evidence before they have a chance to dismantle anything." I watched him key the radio and call for available personnel. My hands had started that subtle shaking again, the same tremor that had hit me when I heard my name called from inside the cabin. The memory of that voice sent cold creeping up my spine. "Martinez, you available for immediate field response?" James spoke into the handset. Robert's voice crackled back through the speaker. "Copy that. What's the situation?" "Unauthorized structure discovery in Section 7. Need investigation team assembled within the hour." "Roger. I'll grab Collins and Stevens." James set down the radio and started pulling investigation gear from the equipment locker. Digital cameras, measuring tape, sample containers, the whole documentation kit. Each item he added to the pack made me more nervous. "Mike, you'll guide us to the exact location," he said without looking up from his preparations. "David, I want you on perimeter documentation. Look for any signs of regular access routes or construction materials." I nodded because refusing wasn't an option, but everything in my body was screaming against the idea of returning to that clearing. The voice had known my name. It had spoken with a depth that belonged in nightmares, not in any human throat. Robert arrived 20 minutes later with Collins and Stevens, both experienced rangers who'd handled unauthorized encampment situations before. The whole team gathered around James's desk as he outlined the mission parameters and showed them the coordinates. "Simple documentation and assessment," James explained. "We photograph everything, measure dimensions, look for any identification or personal property. Nobody touches anything unless absolutely necessary." The drive back to Section 7 took another 40 minutes. and I spent every mile hoping we'd find something different when we got there. Maybe the cabin would be gone. Maybe it had never been there at all. And David and I had both suffered some kind of smoke-induced shared hallucination. Maybe I wouldn't have to face whatever was waiting inside that building. But as we hiked back through the burn areas toward the coordinates I'd marked, I knew I was lying to myself. The cabin would be there, exactly where we'd left it. The windows would be clean and the firewood would be stacked with military precision, and something inside would be waiting for us to get close enough. "Should be right up ahead," I told James, pointing through the scattered trees toward the clearing. We crested a small rise, and I could see the open space where the cabin had sat. My steps slowed automatically as we approached the spot where David and I had stood that morning. The clearing was empty. I stopped walking entirely and stared at the open ground. Grass and scattered pine needles covered the area where the log cabin had been. No foundation stones, no disturbed earth, no indication that any structure had ever existed there. "This is it?" James asked, looking around the unremarkable patch of forest. "This is where it was," I said, but my voice came out thin and uncertain. James pulled out his GPS unit and checked our coordinates against the ones I'd marked on my field map. "Echo 4, confirmed. You're sure this is the exact spot?" I walked to where the front door had been, where I'd heard my name called from inside with that impossible voice. Nothing but ordinary forest floor beneath my boots. No marks, no cleared areas, no signs that anything larger than a squirrel had been here recently. "Mike." David came up beside me, his expression puzzled. "This isn't right. The cabin was right here." "Spread out," James instructed the team. "Check a 100-yard radius. Look for any signs of recent construction or habitation." Collins and Stevens moved through the surrounding trees with careful steps, checking the ground for foundation materials or construction debris. Robert worked the perimeter, looking for access trails or equipment cache sites. I stood in the center of the clearing and turned in a slow circle, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, or what I wasn't seeing. The cabin had been here. Solid logs, clean windows, neat stack of firewood. David had seen it too. "Mike." James appeared at my shoulder, his voice carefully neutral. "Walk me through exactly what you observed." I described the building in detail, pointing to where each element had been positioned. The door, the windows, the chimney, the firewood. James listened without interrupting, sometimes checking his own notes against my account. "And you're certain about the construction quality?" he asked. "You mentioned it appeared to be in good condition." "Perfect condition, like someone had been maintaining it regularly." James nodded and made another note. Around us, the search team continued working through the forest, their calls carrying back negative findings. No foundation stones, no construction materials, no evidence of human habitation. The knot in my stomach grew tighter with each negative report. I knew what this looked like. I knew what James was thinking, what the whole team was thinking. Stress hallucination, smoke inhalation, ranger fatigue from too many consecutive days in the field. "Nothing out here," Robert called out from the tree line. "No trails, no disturbance patterns, no recent human activity." Stevens and Collins reported similar results from their search areas. Clean forest, undisturbed ground, no signs that anyone had been building or camping in the area. James closed his notebook and looked at me with the expression I'd been dreading. Concerned but skeptical. The look of a supervisor who just watched one of his rangers describe a detailed hallucination. "Mike, when's the last time you took leave?" "I'm not hallucinating," I said, though the words came out more defensive than I'd intended. The cabin was here. David saw it too. But even as I said it, I could see the doubt creeping into David's expression. He was looking around the empty clearing with the same confusion I felt, but he was also looking at me like he wasn't entirely sure what he'd seen anymore. Smoke inhalation can cause very realistic visual disturbances, James said quietly. Combined with fatigue and extended exposure to burn conditions, it's not uncommon for experienced personnel to report seeing structures or people that aren't actually present. I wanted to argue, to insist that what we'd experienced was real. But how could I explain the voice without sounding completely unstable? How could I tell him that something inside the cabin had called my name, with a voice that belonged in the deepest nightmares? We've all been pushing hard on this burn operation, James continued. 3 consecutive days, extended exposure to smoke and heat stress. I should have rotated the teams more frequently. The walk back to the vehicles went by in uncomfortable silence. I could feel the sideways glances from the other Rangers, the quiet conversations they'd have later about Mike Thompson losing it in the field. By the time we reached the trucks, James had already put together his incident report in his head. Back at the ranger station, I sat in my truck and watched through the window as James typed up his documentation. Probable cause: stress-induced hallucination made worse by smoke inhalation and tiredness. Recommended action: mandatory leave and fitness evaluation. I knew the protocol because I'd seen it happen to other Rangers over the years. Good people who'd pushed too hard or seen too much, who'd started reporting things that didn't quite make sense. The Park Service took mental health seriously, which meant I was about to be placed on administrative leave until a psychological evaluation determined I was fit for duty. The cabin had been there. I'd seen it. David had seen it. And something inside had known my name. But I couldn't prove any of that now, and trying to insist on it would only make me look more crazy. James finished his typing and filed the report in the system. Somewhere in the Park Service database, my name was now attached to an incident involving hallucinations and possible mental health concerns. I started the truck and drove home, knowing that whatever had happened in that clearing was far from over. Chapter 3. Rex met me at the front door when I got home, tail wagging like he always did when I returned from work. Normal dog behavior, normal evening routine. I scratched behind his ears and tried to convince myself that everything about this day fell within the range of normal. The administrative leave wouldn't be official until tomorrow, but James had made it clear that I needed time away from field duties. I opened a beer and sat down at my kitchen table with the incident report James had printed for me to review. Clean, clinical language that made the morning's events sound like a textbook case of Ranger burnout. No mention of the voice calling my name. No description of the weird depth and tone that had made my hands shake. Just a straightforward documentation of visual disturbance brought on by environmental stressors. Maybe James was right. Maybe 3 consecutive days of prescribed burn operations had pushed me past my limits without me realizing it. Smoke inhalation could definitely cause hallucinations, and fatigue made people see things that weren't there. Medical fact. But David had seen the cabin too. I pushed that thought away and focused on the paperwork. The Park Service had protocols for situations like this because they happened. Rangers worked in isolated conditions under physical and mental stress. Sometimes that stress showed up in ways that seemed completely real but weren't actually there. Rex wandered over and dropped his head on my lap, looking up at me with those brown eyes that always seemed to understand more than a dog should. I scratched behind his ears again and took another sip of beer. The cabin had felt real. The voice had sounded real. But empty clearings don't lie, and 5 experienced rangers searching a 100-yard radius don't miss evidence of recent construction. I finished the beer and headed to bed early, hoping sleep would help reset whatever had gotten mixed up in my head during the burn operation. Rex followed me down the hallway and settled on his usual spot beside the bed. He'd been doing that for 5 years, ever since I'd adopted him from the rescue shelter in Bozeman. Sleep came easier than I'd expected, probably because exhaustion finally caught up with everything else. No dreams about cabins or impossible voices, just the deep, blank rest that comes after pushing your body and mind too hard for too long. Then Rex started barking. The sound jolted me awake so fast that I nearly fell out of bed. Rex never barked at night. Never. He might whine if he heard elk moving through the yard, or give a single woof if a car door slammed somewhere down the road, but aggressive barking wasn't part of his personality. I checked the clock on my nightstand. 12:15 in the morning. Rex was standing in the living room, focused on the big window that looked out toward the meadow behind my house. His hackles were raised in a ridge along his spine, and a low growl rumbled in his throat between barks. He was staring at something outside with an intensity I'd never seen from him before. "What is it, boy?" I walked over to the window and looked out into the darkness. The meadow stretched away from my back porch, maybe 300 yards of open grass before the tree line started. During the day, it was a peaceful view that reminded me why I'd chosen to live this far from town. At night, it was usually just empty space under whatever moon happened to be showing. Tonight, it wasn't empty. The cabin sat in the middle of the meadow, exactly where it had no business being. Same rough logs, same stone chimney, same impossible presence that shouldn't exist. Warm light came from its windows, the kind of steady yellow light that comes from oil lamps or a wood fire. Rex kept barking, his whole body stiff with alarm. I stood at my window and stared at the building that had cost me my job and my credibility, now sitting 300 yards from my back door like it belonged there. This wasn't smoke inhalation. This wasn't fatigue or stress-induced hallucination. This was something else entirely, and it had followed me home. I went to my bedroom and got my service pistol from the gun safe, along with the heavy-duty flashlight I kept for emergency calls. Rex watched me gear up, but didn't stop barking. If anything, his alarm seemed to increase as I headed for the back door. The night air was cool against my face when I stepped outside. Rex tried to follow, but I made him stay on the porch. Whatever was happening, I didn't want him involved. The walk across the meadow felt longer than 300 yards. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness ahead of me, lighting up patches of grass and scattered wildflowers. Normal meadow contents. Nothing that suggested why a cabin would suddenly appear in the middle of it. But the building grew larger as I approached, solid and real in a way that made my throat tight. I could smell wood smoke now drifting from the chimney. The windows kept glowing with that warm, steady light. "Michael." The voice came from inside the cabin, just like before. Same impossible depth, same unnatural sound that belonged in nightmares rather than rural Montana. But this time, something was different about the tone. "You ran away today," the voice continued, somehow carrying clearly across the remaining distance between me and the building. "Brought your friends back to find nothing. Did that make you feel better?" I stopped walking and raised my pistol, though I wasn't sure what I planned to shoot. The cabin itself? The voice had no clear source, no target I could aim at. "You cannot escape this," the voice said, and now I could hear amusement in those unnatural tones. "Distance means nothing. Your time grows short." I aimed my flashlight at the windows, where the warm light was coming from. The beam cut through the glass and showed only black interior. No furniture, no fire, no source for the light I could see from 300 yards away, but not from 30 feet. The problem made my stomach feel sick. Light that existed from a distance but disappeared up close. A voice that spoke from inside an empty building that shouldn't exist in the first place. I backed away from the cabin, keeping my flashlight pointed at those impossible windows. The light came back as soon as I put enough distance between myself and the building, warm and inviting like someone was home and waiting for visitors. The walk back to my house felt like the longest 300 yards of my life. Rex was still barking when I reached the porch, still looking at the meadow with every muscle in his body tense. I looked where he was looking and saw that the cabin stayed exactly where it had been, windows shining peacefully in the darkness. I locked the back door and checked it twice. Then I moved to the living room window and sat in my armchair with the pistol across my lap. Rex finally stopped barking and came over to sit beside me, but he never took his eyes off the meadow. We spent the remaining hours of night like that, watching the cabin that couldn't exist, but refused to disappear. The warm light in its windows never blinked, never got dimmer, never showed any sign of the emptiness I'd seen with my flashlight. By the time the eastern horizon started showing the first hints of dawn, two things had become absolutely clear. James was wrong about the hallucination, and whatever had spoken to me from inside that building knew exactly where I lived. Chapter 4. Something had changed in the quality of Rex's alertness that pulled me out of sleep. I dozed off in the armchair sometime before dawn, my service pistol still across my lap and my neck stiff from the awkward angle. Rex was no longer staring at the meadow through the living room window. Now he was focused on the front door. I checked my watch. 6:20 in the morning. Early light came through the curtains, but I kept my attention on Rex rather than looking outside. His ears were pinned forward, and his whole body held that rigid tension I'd learned to recognize over the past few hours. The meadow was empty when I finally forced myself to look. No cabin, no warm light from impossible windows, no structure that shouldn't exist sitting where my view used to be peaceful and unremarkable. Just grass and scattered wildflowers going to the tree line, exactly like it had been for the 5 years I'd lived here. But Rex wasn't watching the meadow anymore. He was watching the front of the house with the same intensity he'd shown all night, ears twitching at sounds I couldn't hear. A low whine started in his throat, not the aggressive warning bark from before, but something closer to distress. I stood up from the chair and immediately felt every muscle in my back protest the night spent in that position. I moved toward the front window and looked through the edge of the curtain. My front yard looked normal. The gravel driveway, the wooden fence, the mailbox at the road. Nothing out of place, nothing that should make Rex act like something dangerous was coming toward the house. Then Rex started barking again, sharp and frantic in a way that made my chest tight. He was staring directly at the front door now, hackles raised and body coiled like he was preparing to defend against something I couldn't see. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open, expecting to find nothing but morning air and maybe an elk that had wandered too close to the house. A boy stood on my porch. He looked about 8 years old, with messy hair that might have been blonde under better circumstances but was now dirty and matted. His clothes belonged to another era entirely. Wool pants that ended just below his knees, a button-up shirt with a collar too formal for any modern child, and leather boots that looked handmade rather than manufactured. Everything about his appearance suggested he'd walked out of a photograph from the 1940s. Except for his eyes. Those held a depth of knowledge that belonged in someone who'd lived far longer than 8 years. "Hello, Michael," the boy said. The voice that came from his small body was exactly the same as the one that had called to me from inside the cabin. Deep and clear with that unnatural heaviness that made my ears hurt. Hearing those impossible sounds come from a child's throat sent cold fear through me. Rex stopped barking but didn't relax. If anything, he seemed more upset as he backed away from the door, whining nonstop now. "You're being hunted," the boy continued, his young face contrasting grotesquely with the ancient voice. "This is your final chance to escape. I gripped the pistol tighter, though pointing a weapon at what appeared to be a child felt wrong in every possible way. The contradiction between his appearance and his voice was breaking something fundamental in my understanding of what was real. "If you encounter the presence again, you will die," he said with matter-of-fact certainty that belonged in a medical diagnosis rather than a warning from someone who should be worried about homework and bicycle rides. My mouth felt too dry to form words. Questions crowded in my head. Who was he? Where had he come from? What did he mean by hunted? But none of them made it past the terror that was slowly replacing rational thought. "Distance will not matter," the boy continued, taking a step closer to my door. "Geography means nothing to what seeks you, but time still offers opportunity." The morning air carried no scent from him, no warmth of a living body, nothing that suggested he was more than a projection of whatever had spoken to me from the cabin. "You need to leave immediately," he said, and for the first time something like urgency crept into that impossible voice. "Do not pack. Do not delay. Your window of safety closes rapidly." Before I could respond, before I could ask any of the questions burning in my throat, the boy turned and ran toward the tree line. Not the awkward, stumbling run of a normal 8-year-old, but a smooth glide that covered ground with unnatural efficiency. I watched him reach the pines and simply vanish among the trunks, as if the forest had absorbed him without leaving any trace of his passage. I stood in my doorway for several minutes after he disappeared, waiting for him to reappear, or for Rex to calm down, or for any indication that I hadn't just received a death threat from a child who shouldn't exist. None of those things happened. Rex continued whining and pacing near the front door. The forest remained empty and silent. The meadow behind my house showed no signs that a cabin had ever sat there, glowing with impossible light. But the boy's warning repeated in my head with the same weight as his unnatural voice. "You're being hunted. This is your final chance to escape." I closed the door and locked it, though I understood now that locks meant nothing against whatever was pursuing me. Rex followed me to the kitchen where I found my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I reached Sarah's number. She answered on the second ring, her voice thick with sleep. "Mike, it's not even 7 in the morning." "I need to come stay with you," I said, without any preamble or explanation. "What?" She was awake now, concern sharp in her voice. "Mike, what's wrong? You sound terrible." "I'm leaving Montana today. Can I stay at your apartment?" "Of course, but Mike, what happened? Is this about the leave of absence? Did something else happen at work?" I looked out my kitchen window toward the meadow where the cabin had appeared last night, then toward the front yard where an 8-year-old boy had just delivered my death sentence with a voice that belonged in the deepest nightmares. "I'll explain when I get there," I told her. "I should be in Denver by tonight." "Mike, you're scaring me. Talk to me. What's going on?" But I couldn't explain over the phone. Couldn't tell her that I was running away from something that built cabins in empty clearings and sent children with very old voices to deliver warnings. Couldn't describe the impossible things I'd seen without sounding like I belonged in a psychiatric facility. "I have to go," I said. "I'll call you when I'm on the road." I ended the call before she could ask more questions, and immediately started moving through my house, grabbing only the essentials. Clothes for a week, my service weapon, important documents, and Rex's food and leash. Everything else could stay behind. The boy had told me not to pack, not to delay, but I needed at least the basics if I was going to rebuild my life in Colorado. 15 minutes to gather what mattered most, then Rex and I were in my truck heading down the gravel driveway. I checked my mirrors constantly during the 40-minute drive to the interstate, expecting to see the cabin following us somehow, or the boy standing beside the road. But the landscape stayed normal, predictable. without anything that shouldn't belong. The relief I felt when I reached the on-ramp to Interstate 90 was so intense it made my hands shake on the steering wheel. Rex settled into the passenger seat and finally relaxed for the first time since the previous evening, which I took as confirmation that we were moving in the right direction. 8 hours to Denver. 8 hours to put enough distance between myself and whatever was hunting me to maybe, possibly, find some safety in Colorado. I merged into traffic and drove away from Montana, leaving behind my job, my house, and any hope that the impossible things I'd experienced had been hallucinations brought on by smoke inhalation and fatigue. The relief on Sarah's face when I knocked on her apartment door that evening made the 8-hour drive feel worthwhile. She'd been waiting by the window according to the way she immediately pulled me inside, Rex trailing behind with his tail carefully wagging. Her one-bedroom place in downtown Denver felt impossibly small after my house in Montana, but the urban sounds filtering through her windows, traffic, sirens, people talking on the sidewalk, created a barrier of normalcy I hadn't realized I needed. "You look exhausted," she said, studying my face while Rex explored the unfamiliar space. "When did you last sleep?" I couldn't remember. Sleep felt like something other people did. "I'll explain everything," I told her, though I already knew I wouldn't. Not the real explanation, not the parts about voices calling my name from empty buildings or 8-year-old children delivering death threats with ancient authority. Sarah made coffee while I sat on her couch and tried to process the change in environment. Her apartment was on the 3rd floor of a converted brick building with large windows facing the street and neighbors on all sides. The constant background noise of city life felt protective in a way I hadn't expected. Whatever had been hunting me in Montana belonged to wilderness and isolation. Here, surrounded by concrete and crowds, those rules might not apply. Over the next few days, Sarah gave me space to decompress while I figured out my next move. I called James and submitted my formal resignation from the Montana Park Service, citing personal reasons that required relocation. He accepted without surprise, probably relieved to close the file on the ranger who'd reported hallucinations in Section 7. The transfer request to Rocky Mountain National Park went through faster than I'd expected. Personnel shortages meant they needed experienced rangers, and my record was clean aside from the recent incident report. 2 weeks after arriving in Denver, I was back in uniform and assigned to patrol duties in a different mountain environment. The work felt known to me, but I found myself avoiding the remote sections of my assigned areas. Whenever dispatch offered assignments to backcountry trails or isolated campsites, I volunteered for visitor center duties instead, or requested backup for what should have been routine solo calls. My supervisor noticed, but didn't comment directly, probably assuming I needed time to adjust to Colorado terrain. At Sarah's apartment, I installed additional deadbolts on her front door and suggested keeping the curtains drawn at night. She questioned the locks but went along with my requests, though I caught her watching me with increasing concern as weeks passed. The constant urban noise that had initially felt protective now seemed insufficient. I started checking windows throughout the night, looking around the street below for anything that didn't belong. Rex adapted to apartment living better than I did. He seemed more relaxed in Denver, sleeping through the night, instead of maintaining the careful watch he'd kept during our final weeks in Montana. His behavior suggested we'd succeeded in putting enough distance between ourselves and whatever had been pursuing us. The nightmares started about a month after we'd settled in Denver. Always the same scenario. I'd wake up in Sarah's bed and look out her window to see the cabin sitting in the middle of the busy street, surrounded by parked cars and completely blocking traffic. Warm light would glow from its windows while impossible voices called my name from 3 stories below. I'd check every room in the apartment, finding each one empty but somehow wrong. as if the known space had been subtly changed in ways I couldn't identify. Sarah woke me from these dreams repeatedly, shaking my shoulder when my movements or muttered words disturbed her sleep. I'd lie awake afterward, listening to the city sounds and convincing myself that urban environments offered protection from things that belonged in remote forests. 3 months passed without any sign that our relocation had failed. No cabins appeared in unexpected places. No children with very old voices delivered warnings on Sarah's doorstep. No impossible things challenged my understanding of what was real versus what was hallucination. I started allowing myself to believe that distance had indeed provided safety. Maybe the entity or presence or whatever had spoken to me from that cabin was bound to specific locations. Maybe my supervisor, James, had been partially correct about stress-induced episodes, even if his explanation didn't account for the voice or the boy's warning. Geographic separation seemed to have broken whatever connection had existed. My work performance in Colorado improved as this confidence grew. I accepted more remote assignments and stopped requesting unnecessary backup. The paranoid behaviors that had marked my first months in Denver gradually relaxed as evidence mounted that we'd successfully escaped whatever had been hunting me. Sarah noticed the change in my mood. I caught her smiling when she thought I wasn't looking. Relief obvious as she watched me return to something closer to normal behavior. The additional locks remained, and I still preferred keeping curtains closed. But the constant watch that had characterized my early weeks in her apartment faded into manageable caution. But Sarah's patience with partial explanations had limits. "I need to know what happened in Montana," she said one evening in late fall, 3 months after my arrival. We'd been sitting on her couch watching television when she muted the sound and turned to face me directly. "I've given you space to work through whatever this is, but your behavior isn't getting better. It's just getting more controlled." Rex looked up from his spot on the floor, sensing the shift in conversation tone. "I mean it, Mike. The locks, the curtains, the way you check windows at night when you think I'm asleep. Something traumatic happened to you, and I can't help if you won't tell me what it was." I'd rehearsed various versions of this conversation in my head, different levels of truth mixed with protective lies. But sitting there looking at her face, seeing the genuine concern and frustration that had been building for months, I found myself abandoning all the careful explanations I'd prepared. "I found something in the forest," I said. "Something that shouldn't have existed." Sarah leaned forward, encouraging me to continue. "There was a cabin in Section 7 during our prescribed burn operation. David saw it too. But when we brought the team back to investigate, it was gone. Completely gone. Like it had never been there." I told her about the voice calling my name from inside the empty building, about the search that found nothing, about James's report attributing everything to stress-induced hallucination, about waking up to find the same cabin sitting in my meadow, glowing with impossible light. "And there was a boy," I continued, watching Sarah's expression change from concern to something approaching alarm. 8 years old, wearing clothes from decades ago. He spoke with the same voice that had called to me from the cabin, deep and wrong, like it belonged in someone much older. Sarah remained silent while I described the boy's warning about being hunted, his insistence that distance wouldn't matter, his urgency about leaving immediately. When I finished, the apartment felt too quiet, despite the usual street noise filtering through the windows. "Mike," she said carefully, "what you're describing sounds like a severe psychological episode. Multiple hallucinations, paranoid delusions, persistent fear of being pursued by something that doesn't exist." I'd expected skepticism, but hearing her clinical assessment spoken aloud made my chest tight. "I'm a nurse," she continued. "I've seen trauma responses that manifest in exactly these ways. The mind creates elaborate explanations for stress that feels too overwhelming to process normally." "David saw the cabin too," I insisted, "but he didn't hear the voice, and he seemed confused when it wasn't there during the search, right? That suggests his perception was different from yours." Sarah reached over and took my hand, her touch warm against my palm. "I'm not saying you're lying or making this up intentionally. I'm saying your brain created these experiences because something real traumatized you, and this was how your mind tried to make sense of it." I wanted to argue, to insist that the cabin and the voice and the boy had been absolutely real, but 3 months of safety in Denver had let doubt creep into my certainty. Maybe James had been right about the hallucinations. Maybe the stress of the prescribed burn operation had pushed me past some psychological breaking point I hadn't recognized. "I think you should talk to someone," Sarah said. "A professional who specializes in trauma counseling. Not because I think you're crazy, but because something happened to you that your mind is still trying to process." I nodded, though the idea of describing impossible voices and old children to a therapist made my stomach turn. But Sarah was right about my behavior not improving, just becoming more controlled. If professional help could tell the difference between real threats and psychological responses to trauma, maybe I could finally understand what had actually happened in Section 7. Rex came over and put his head on my lap, looking up at me with those brown eyes that always seemed to understand more than they should. He'd been there for everything: the cabin, the voice, the boy's warning. His reactions had matched mine exactly, which suggested either we'd both experienced the same real events, or my psychological state had influenced my interpretation of normal dog behavior. "Okay," I told Sarah. "I'll find someone to talk to." The relief on her face was immediate and obvious. She'd been carrying the weight of my unexplained behavior for months, trying to support me without understanding what kind of support I needed. But even as I agreed to seek professional help, a part of me stayed convinced that the distance from Montana was the real source of our safety. 3 months without incident felt like proof that geography mattered more than psychology when it came to whatever had been hunting me. That confidence would prove to be temporary, but for now it allowed me to consider the possibility that healing might involve talking rather than running. The therapy sessions had actually helped, which surprised me more than anyone. Dr. Martinez, a different Martinez than my former colleague Robert, worked with trauma counseling for first responders. Over 3 months of weekly appointments, we'd worked through what she called acute stress reaction with dissociative features. The clinical terms made the Montana incidents feel manageable, explainable, like symptoms that could be treated rather than impossible events that defied logic. 6 months after leaving Montana, I'd finally started to believe her diagnosis. The prescribed burn operation had pushed me past my psychological limits in ways I hadn't recognized at the time. Smoke inhalation, fatigue, and accumulated stress had created a perfect storm for my mind to manufacture elaborate experiences that felt completely real. The cabin, the voice, the boy, all products of a brain trying to process trauma it couldn't handle normally. Rex and I were patrolling the eastern sector of Rocky Mountain National Park when I saw it again. I'd parked my truck at the trailhead near Emerald Lake and was walking the perimeter to check for illegal camping when the structure came into view through the pine trees. The same rough logs, the same stone chimney, the same impossible presence that had cost me my job and peace of mind in Montana. My legs stopped working for several seconds while I stared at the cabin sitting beside the mountain lake as if it belonged there. Rex whined and pressed against my leg, his body trembling with the same tension I'd felt that night in my meadow 6 months ago. This wasn't possible. Dr. Martinez had explained that traumatic hallucinations didn't typically recur once the underlying stress was addressed. We'd made significant progress in our sessions. I'd been sleeping through the night, my paranoid behaviors had decreased, and I'd successfully completed dozens of solo patrols without incident. But there it was, solid and real and completely wrong, reflecting perfectly in the still water of the lake. I reached for my radio to call dispatch, needing backup and witnesses to verify what I was seeing. The radio crackled with static when I pressed the transmit button, then went completely dead. No response to my repeated attempts to raise anyone on any channel. My hands shook as I clipped the useless radio back to my belt and started walking backward toward my truck, keeping my eyes on the cabin. Rex followed reluctantly, whining continuously now and looking over his shoulder at the structure beside the lake. The truck key turned in the ignition, but the engine didn't catch. No lights on the dashboard, no sound from the starter, nothing to indicate electrical power was reaching any of the vehicle's systems. I tried again with the same result, complete mechanical failure without warning or explanation. The realization hit me. This wasn't a psychological episode or trauma response. The entity hadn't been bound to Montana locations like I'd convinced myself over the past 6 months. It had followed me to Colorado and was now demonstrating that my radio and truck would remain useless until it decided otherwise. I'd been deliberately lured to this remote section of the park where other rangers rarely patrolled and hikers seldom ventured. No one would look for me until I failed to check in that evening, and by then it would be too late for whatever the presence had planned. "Michael," the voice called from inside the cabin, exactly as it had in Section 7 6 months ago. The same impossible depth and resonance that belonged in nightmares rather than mountain lakes. Rex backed away from the sound, hackles raised and body coiled with fear. "Your time is up," the voice continued with unmistakable satisfaction. "You ignored the warning." The boy's words repeated in my memory. "This is your final chance to escape. If you encounter the presence again, you will die." I'd run to Colorado believing distance would provide safety, but the entity had simply waited until I felt secure enough to venture into remote areas alone. "Distance means nothing," the voice reminded me as if reading my thoughts. "Geography cannot contain what you have awakened." For 6 months, I'd been telling myself that Dr. Martinez was right about trauma-induced hallucinations, that James had been correct about stress and smoke inhalation, that my mind had manufactured impossible experiences to cope with psychological pressure I couldn't handle normally. But trauma responses didn't disable vehicles or kill radio communications. Hallucinations didn't follow people across state lines and appear beside mountain lakes with perfect timing to ensure isolation. Something was about to happen that no amount of therapy or clinical explanation could address. I could sit in my useless truck and wait for it, or I could face whatever was coming on my own terms. I got out of the truck and started walking toward the cabin. Rex tried to follow, but I made him stay behind, just like I had that night in my meadow. Whatever was waiting inside that building, I wouldn't involve my dog in the confrontation. The walk across the rocky shoreline felt like the longest 100 yards of my life. Each step brought me closer to answers I wasn't sure I wanted, but running had accomplished nothing except delaying this moment for 6 months. I stopped directly in front of the cabin door and forced my voice to work. "What do you want from me?" The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if the presence had vanished again, leaving me alone beside a lake with a disabled truck and dead radio. Then the voice responded from behind the wooden door. "You disturbed something during your prescribed burn that was meant to remain hidden." The clinical tone carried no emotion, just matter-of-fact explanation delivered with that unnatural depth that made my ears ache. "I was bound to that location for decades," the voice continued, "contained by barriers your kind established long ago, but your intrusion weakened those bonds. Your fire burned through protections that were never meant to be touched. I thought about the prescribed burn operation in Section 7, the systematic clearing of underbrush that had proceeded exactly according to plan. Nothing unusual about the process, nothing to suggest we'd damaged anything beyond accumulated vegetation. "What are you?" I asked. "I am what remains when the natural order is violated, what emerges when boundaries meant to contain are breached. Your people understood this once, before they forgot the old warnings." The door remained closed, but the voice came through clearly, as if no barrier existed between us. "You freed me from Montana, Michael. Now I require an anchor to remain bound to this new place. The alternative is to spread beyond any possibility of containment." My mouth felt dry as I understood what was being offered. "You can become that anchor willingly, accepting the responsibility your actions created. Or you can die here, and I will find another to serve that purpose." Rex barked from beside the truck, sharp and desperate, as if he understood the choice being presented. "If I become this anchor, what happens to other people, other rangers who patrol these areas? They will be safe as long as the bonds hold, as long as you maintain your connection to this place." I looked around at the pristine lake, the towering peaks, the wilderness that thousands of visitors enjoyed every year without knowing that something ancient and dangerous required constant containment. "How do I know you're telling the truth? How do I know you won't hurt people regardless of what I choose?" "Because I require stability, not chaos. Destruction serves no purpose if it eliminates potential anchors. Your cooperation ensures my containment. Your death necessitates finding another, which risks exposure during the search." The logic was cold but consistent. The entity needed someone to willingly accept responsibility for keeping it tied to a specific location. My refusal meant it would be forced to create another anchor through violence, which might attract attention that threatened its hiding spot. "What does it mean to be an anchor?" "You will remain connected to this place. Your life force will power the barriers that contain me. You will continue your work, your relationships, your normal existence, but you will never be truly free to leave." I thought about Sarah waiting for me in Denver, not knowing that her boyfriend was making a deal for his soul beside a mountain lake. About Rex, who'd followed me through impossible experiences without understanding why his world had become so dangerous. About the hikers and families who visited Rocky Mountain National Park expecting nothing more threatening than altitude sickness and unpredictable weather. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. "I accept," I said. The moment the words left my mouth, something basic changed in the air around me. Not visible or heard, but real in the way that harsh cold becomes real when it reaches bone-deep levels. A connection formed between myself and the landscape that felt like invisible chains settling around my chest. "It is done," the voice said, and for the first time carried something approaching satisfaction. "The bonds are renewed. You are bound to this place as I am bound to you." The cabin started to fade, becoming see-through like morning fog touched by sunlight. Within seconds, it had disappeared entirely, leaving only the natural shoreline and pine trees that belonged beside the mountain lake. I stood alone on the rocky shore, feeling permanently connected to these mountains now. My radio came back to life, dispatch calling for status updates from various patrols. My truck engine started on the first try when I returned to test it. Rex climbed into the passenger seat and looked at me with those brown eyes that always seemed to understand more than they should. He could sense the change in me, the invisible rope that now connected my life to keeping something dangerous in a place where families came to experience natural beauty. I drove back to the visitor center and completed my patrol report, documenting nothing unusual beyond routine maintenance issues in the eastern sector. No cabin, no voice, No supernatural entities requiring permanent human anchors to prevent them from spreading beyond containment. That night, I called Sarah and told her my therapy sessions were going well, that I felt more grounded and stable than I had in months, that the paranoid behaviors and constant watching were finally relaxing into normal caution. All of that was true, in its way. I did feel more grounded, but not because of psychological healing. I felt stable because my connection to the Rocky Mountain wilderness was now as permanent as bedrock. The watching had relaxed because the threat was no longer pursuing me. It was bound to me. Rex and I would continue our patrols, our normal routines, our life that looked unremarkable from the outside. But we would never truly leave this place, and something very old would remain contained as long as our connection lasted. I'd saved countless future visitors from running into what I'd awakened in Montana. The price was my freedom, but that seemed like an acceptable trade for the safety of people who would never know how close they'd come to facing something that belonged in nightmares rather than national parks. The entity was right about one thing. I would continue my work, my relationships, my normal existence. But every morning when I woke up, I would feel those invisible chains connecting me to the mountains, reminding me that some responsibilities last forever,